2 years before 146 workers died in the Triangle Shirtwaist fire, the women in that factory had already walked out over locked doors and fire hazards. They were beaten, arrested, and many went back to work behind the same doors. Then, on a Saturday afternoon in March 1911, a fire broke out on the 8th floor. It burned for 18 minutes. By the end, young garment workers were trapped at an exit that would not open, crushed on a failing fire escape, or falling to the pavement below while a crowd watched helplessly. The disaster helped create the modern American workplace. The 2 owners were later acquitted. To understand what happened in 1911, you have to start in 1909 in a packed hall at Cooper Union on a November night. The garment industry of New York ran on the labor of young immigrant women, Jewish girls from the Russian Empire, Italian girls from Sicily and the South, working 9, 10, 12 hours a day over sewing machines, 6 days a week for a few dollars. The largest shirtwaist maker in the city was the Triangle Waist Company, run by 2 men known as the Shirtwaist Kings, Max Blank and Isaac Harris. They had come up through the sweatshops themselves. Now they owned the top 3 floors of a modern 10-story building off Washington Square. That November night, after hours of cautious speeches by careful men, a 23-year-old worker named Clara Lemlich stood up from the floor. She had already been hospitalized once, beaten by hired thugs for union organizing. She interrupted the speakers, and in Yiddish she said, "I am a working girl, one of those on strike against intolerable conditions. I am tired of listening to speakers who talk in general terms. I offer a resolution that a general strike be declared." Now, within days, more than 20,000 garment workers walked out. It was the largest strike by women the United States had ever seen. They demanded shorter hours, better pay, and safety. Unlocked doors. Working fire escapes. The Triangle owners fought back hardest of all. They hired thugs to beat the picketers. They paid police to arrest them. And when the strike finally settled and most factories signed, Blank and Harris refused. Their workers went back with nothing. The doors stayed locked. The problem is, a warning ignored does not expire. It waits. The Ash building was 10 stories of iron and brick, and it was called fireproof. The building itself was. Its contents were not. The Triangle factory filled the top 3 floors with everything a fire could want. Cotton shirtwaists on wires above the tables. Tissue paper patterns hanging in rows. Bins of fabric scraps, hundreds of pounds of them, accumulating for weeks between collections. Wooden tables, wooden floors, and machine oil soaked into both. The 8th and 9th floors held about 500 workers on a full day. For all of them, there were 2 staircases and a single exterior fire escape, a flimsy iron ladder that ended in mid-air above a basement skylight. The city had allowed it as a substitute for the 3rd staircase the law required. The fire department had inspected the building and reported it unsafe. Not enough ways out. 4 small fires had already broken out in previous years. The city's own fire chief had publicly predicted 4 months earlier that a high-rise fire disaster was coming. And then there was the company policy. At quitting time, every worker filed out through a single exit on the Green Street side, where a watchman inspected their handbags for stolen thread and scraps of lace. To make that system work, the other door, the Washington Place stairway door on the 9th floor, was kept locked during working hours. The foreman carried the key. Saturday, the 25th of March 1911, was payday. At 20 minutes to 5, 500 people were reaching for their coats, their week's wages in their pockets. On the 8th floor, under a cutter's table, in a bin of cotton scraps, something began to smolder. The fire took the 8th floor in about 3 minutes. Cotton burns almost like paper. Flame ran along the scrap bins, up the hanging patterns, across the tables. The workers there mostly escaped down the Green Street stairs or in the elevators before the heat closed in behind them. The switchboard operator got a warning through to the 10th floor, where the owners were. Blank and Harris climbed to the roof with their children. They had brought them in that afternoon, and law students from the university building next door laid ladders across the gap. About 70 people crossed to safety that way. The call never reached the 9th floor. 250 workers there learned about the fire when it arrived. What happened next happened all at once, at every exit. The Green Street stairway was already burning. Workers rushed to the Washington Place door, the locked one. They pulled, pushed, beat on it, piled against it. The man with the key had already escaped by another route. A machinist would later testify. He watched a young woman named Margaret Schwartz die at that door, trying to claw it open. Others fought through the smoke to the fire escape. It was never built for a crowd. Overloaded, scorched, it tore away from the wall and folded, dropping some 20 people 80 feet into the courtyard below. At the passenger elevators, 2 operators, Joseph Zito and Gaspar Mortillaro, did something extraordinary. Again and again they drove their cars up into the smoke, loading them far past capacity, while women beat on the roof of the cab from above. Between them, they carried out around 150 people, half of everyone who survived. They kept going until the heat warped the rails and the bodies of those who had leapt into the shaft landed on the cars themselves. That left the windows. The fire department reached the scene in under 2 minutes, and it did not matter. Their tallest ladder reached the 6th floor. The workers were on the 9th. Firemen stretched life nets. The nets tore like paper under bodies, falling from 100 feet. The crowd in the street watched people appear in the windows, one after another, hold to the frames and step out. Some jumped in 2s and 3s, holding hands. A reporter standing below wrote that he learned a new sound that afternoon, the thud of a body on a stone pavement. 18 minutes, 146 people. 123 of them were women and girls. The youngest, Kate Leone and Rosaria Maltese, were 14 years old. The Maltese family lost a mother and 2 daughters in those 18 minutes. 8 months later, Max Blank and Isaac Harris stood trial for manslaughter. The charge rested on a single door, the locked Washington Place exit, and a single victim, Margaret Schwartz, who died against it. More than 100 witnesses testified for the prosecution. Worker after worker described trying the door and finding it fast. But the owners had hired Max Steuer, the most celebrated defense lawyer in New York. And the judge instructed the jury that to convict, it was not enough that the door was locked. The owners had to have known it was locked at that moment, beyond a reasonable doubt. Steuer went to work on the prosecution's star witness, a survivor named Kate Alterman. He asked her to tell her story again, then once more. Each time she used nearly the same words, a curtain of fire, a man running like a wildcat. Steuer never accused her of lying. He simply let the jury conclude her testimony had been rehearsed. Then, near the end, a rebuttal witness, Harris's own head cutter of 8 years, testified about a conversation after the fire. He said Harris told him, "The dead ones are dead. Sure, the doors were locked. I wouldn't let them rob my fortune." The jury acquitted both men. One juror said afterward, "I believed the door was locked at the time of the fire. But we couldn't find them guilty unless we believed they knew." 3 years later, the civil suits were settled. The price set on each of the 146 lives was $75. The insurance payout to Blank and Harris ran to roughly $400 per victim. They made money on the fire. And in 1913, 2 years after, Max Blank was arrested again for locking the exit door of his new factory during working hours with the workers inside. He was fined $20. The judge apologized to him for the inconvenience. If the story ended there, it would be only an atrocity. What makes the Triangle Fire different is who was standing in Washington Square that afternoon. Frances Perkins was 30 years old, a social worker taking tea with friends beside the park, when she heard the engines. She reached the building in time to see the workers in the windows and to see them come down. Decades later, as the first woman ever to sit in a United States cabinet, she would say that the Triangle Fire was the day the New Deal was born. The fury after the fire did not fade. Within 3 months, New York created a factory investigating commission, and its leaders were not the usual names. A state senator called Robert Wagner, an assemblyman called Al Smith, and Frances Perkins as chief investigator, personally dragging the two politicians up rickety ladders and through freezing sweatshops at 2 in the morning to see the conditions for themselves. In 4 years, the commission's work produced 38 new laws, the most sweeping labor code in the country. Mandatory fire drills, sprinklers in high buildings, exit doors that open outward and that may never be locked during working hours, limits on child labor, factory inspections with teeth. Follow the people, and you follow the idea. Al Smith became governor of New York. Robert Wagner went to the Senate and wrote the law that protects the right to unionize. Frances Perkins became Secretary of Labor for Franklin Roosevelt and carried the Triangle dead into the New Deal, the 40-hour week, the minimum wage, the ban on child labor, Social Security. When the federal government finally created a single agency for workplace safety in 1970, its lineage traced straight back through her to that afternoon by the park. The Triangle building still stands. It belongs to a university now. Students take chemistry classes on the floor where the machines were. In 2023, 112 years after the fire, a memorial was finally unveiled on its corner. A steel ribbon carrying all 146 names in English, Yiddish, and Italian. Rose Friedman, the last survivor, lived to 107. She spent her whole life telling anyone who would listen what the locked door had cost. She died in 2001, the year the phrase "the fire alarm" went off, and "we just kept working" still described someone's job somewhere. The safety rules are written in blood, usually blood that somebody was warned about first. The workers of the Triangle factory warned everyone 2 years before the fire on the picket line. If you want the next story, subscribe and I'll see you there.